in Europe towards the established parties in every country has been souring with the passage of time. This is especially true, I think, in countries like Germany and France and Britain. And there are a number of issues at play here besides Ukraine. Immigration, for example, is a really big issue. Furthermore, the state of the economy in countries like Britain and France and Germany really matters enormously. So it's not just the Ukraine issue, but there's no question that there is a growing divide between how the publics in the West, and this includes the United States as well as Europe, think about the Ukraine war and how the elites think about it. I think it's fair to say the elites remain as gung-ho as ever for fighting this war to the finish. And the publics across the West now have serious doubts. The center of the EU have about 400 seats as a result of this election. So that's 400 out of 720. So the center, in a very important way, has held, and the center will continue to govern the EU. With regard to the shift, I think that before the election, the right, the right controlled probably about 20% of the votes, and the right now controls 25%. So you basically went from 1/5 to a quarter of the votes. But again, the center still controls the EU. And I think that basically means that the EU's policy toward the Ukraine war is not going to change in any meaningful way. Where there is likely to be change is inside specific countries, and specifically inside France and Germany. And there, when you look at the results of the election, there is reason to think that not immediately, but somewhere down the road, the parties that support the war will lose control of the respective two governments. There's no question that Macron's party did absolutely horrible in these elections, and he is in trouble. And he had already lost his majority in parliament. And he's now called these snap elections, which are for parliament. And you want to remember the French president, and he is the French president, that he gets elected in a different set of elections than the parliament does. So on June 30th, we're going to have an election in France. And it remains to be seen whether or not he is able to improve his position in parliament, that's Macron, or whether the situation is going to get worse. And Jordan Bardella, right, who is associated with Le Pen, he's the party chief, whether he becomes the prime minister of France. I mean, you want to think about this. We're talking about someone from Le Pen, Jordan Bardella, becoming the prime minister of France. This would be a first. It would be shocking. But Macron would still remain the president. Now, it's also important to emphasize that Bardella has not emphasized Ukraine as an important issue. For him, the state of the economy and immigration, which in his mind go together, are the two issues that he emphasizes all the time. So my guess is that even if Bardella becomes the prime minister, this representative of Le Pen becomes the prime minister, rather, that nothing will really change in a substantive way on Ukraine. Remember that Marine Le Pen herself, who's no longer the head of the party, that she has distanced herself from Putin and from Russia after the February 2022 invasion. So inside of Le Pen, you don't have a lot of support for Russia. And it's basically, in a very soft kind of way, been pro-Ukrainian. So I think when you look at that aspect of Le Pen's worldview, coupled with its emphasis on immigration and the economy, I think you're going to get a situation in France, assuming that Bardella wins, that looks a lot like the situation that exists in Italy with Meloni, who was the prime minister there. You want to remember that she was quite outspoken against the war before she became the prime minister of Italy. But when she became the prime minister, she began to back off. And I
Mm.
think you'll get a similar situation with regard to Bardella. So I don't think in either one of those countries, Italy or France, we should expect any major shift on the Ukraine-Russia war. I think some of this accounts for the fact that the AfD has done so well. This is the far-right party in Germany. But the question you have to ask yourself is, who is likely to end up running Germany if the governing coalition collapses? And I think the dominant party in a new coalition would be the Christian Democrats. And the Christian Democrats are hawkish on the Ukraine war. They're pro-Ukraine. So if you get a government that's run by the Christian Democrats, it is likely to be pro-Ukraine. But there's one major caveat here, and that is that it may be forced, the Christian Democrats may be forced to form a coalition with the AfD. This is the right-wing party that we were just talking about. And that would mean you would have a coalition that involved two actors, two main actors. There'd probably be a third party as well, but two main actors, one of which was in favor of continuing the war and another one that was opposed to the war. And how that played itself out, or how that would play itself out in the event that these two parties do dominate the next election, is hard to say, although I think the Christian Democrats would prevail and the war would continue. I think that the Christian Democrats loathe the AfD, and I think that they would have to hold their nose to form a coalition with the AfD, and they would be, in constant conflict. How severe that conflict is hard to say. But the AfD, given the history of Germany, is, anathema to lots of people. So it's not even clear that you could get a coalition to govern Germany that include the AfD. But it is possible that the Christian Democrats would agree to that. And I don't think events at the domestic level would have much effect on Ukraine policy. I think if you're looking for change in terms of Western policy toward this war, it's not in Europe, and that's what we were just discussing. You're not going to get any changes in the immediate or midterm in Europe. It's in the United States where you might very well get a radical change if Donald Trump is elected. Trump has made it clear that he wants to end the war. I mean, he's not going to end it in one day or anything like that. In that regard, he's really kind of just blowing smoke. But his instinct, and it's correct in my opinion, and I know it's correct in your opinion, is to put an end to all this killing as soon as possible. And that is a fundamentally different view than we see with President Biden. So we have on the Ukraine issue here a clear choice with regard to Trump versus Biden. And again, if Trump wins, if he's true to his word, we will see a fundamental shift in Western policy, because Western policy is basically designed and executed in Washington, not in Europe. I believe that they'll do what Biden wants them to do up until the election. And if Biden loses and Trump wins, they'll adjust their policies accordingly. I think the Europeans basically do what we tell them to do on Ukraine. And I think that will continue to be the case whether President Biden is reelected or President Trump is elected once again. So I don't see the Europeans changing in any meaningful way, independent of us or because of public opinion in the 27 countries that are in the EU. I would think from a Russian point of view, it would be desirable to conquer a lot more territory than they now control, to position themselves for the future, because the Russians cannot be sure that Ukraine and the West, even if there is a ceasefire or some sort of settlement, will be content with that settlement and won't go back on the offensive sometime in the future. So if you're playing Russia's hand and you don't trust the West, you don't trust the Ukrainians, and you think that after a ceasefire is put in place, it may again turn into a hot war, you then have a vested interest in taking as much territory as possible now when you're strong and making sure that Ukraine is a truly dysfunctional rump state. So I wouldn't be surprised if Trump comes to office and tries to negotiate a deal that the Russians drag their feet so that they can conquer more territory. Hungary is a member of NATO. It's a frontline state in this conflict. And it's basically saying it doesn't want to participate in NATO policy toward Ukraine. And there is no issue inside of NATO today that even comes close to Ukraine as a salient issue. And Orban is saying, we want nothing to do with it. And Orban is a very influential figure. In fact, he is soon to become the head of the European Union. It's Hungary's turn, so he'll be in charge of the European Union. I don't want to overstate how much power he will have, but the fact is that Orban matters, and he's basically opting out of